Okay. So the poetry of Geoffrey Chaucer has long been labeled obscene, mainly because of the use of sexual and scatological material in his fabliaux. Yet our understanding of what violates taboos and of what can be considered obscene varies with time. What violated social prohibition in the Middle Ages or the 19th century would probably not even shock anyone today, and vice versa. So the reception of Chaucer's bawdy poetry becomes even more problematic when one has to translate it into a different language. How does a translator manage to keep the various nuances of a text, the innuendos and semantic suggestions, as spicy as they used to be, in a different linguistic and cultural context? In this paper, I'll try to illustrate how I attempt to preserve Chaucer's obscenity in my French translation of his poetry, and my translation of the Canterbury Tales has not yet been published. I'm still working on it. It's not before at least 2025, 2026. I'll use examples from the Miller's Tales as a case study here to show how it may be possible to preserve Chaucer's naughty bits as relics to be admired by new generations of readers. That leads me to my first part. Translating is not only connected with linguistic competence, but as Umberto Eco remarked, with intertextual, psychological, and narrative competence. Indeed, translations never concern a comparison between two languages, but rather the interpretation of two texts in two different languages. The interesting thing about the Canterbury Tales is that it has been translated in French before. So I'm working on a retranslation. I accordingly thought that it would be interesting to see how different translators in different times approached Chaucer's obscenity and chose to adapt the deep sense of his fabliaux. The three different translations will thus be compared to the original text and to my own work, so as to see the evolution of my predecessor's relation to obscenity. The first one, entitled Les Contes de Cantorbéry, was a poetic rendition of Chaucer's tales, published in London in 1857, and with a translation by Jean-François de Châtelain, who, if you can see, insists on being called Le Chevalier de Châtelain. This gives you a sense of the context of publication. When Châtelain's translation was printed, France had only recently become a republic, with King Louis-Philippe abdicating in 1848 and dying in England in exile in 1850. So culturally speaking, the 19th century is pretty much the golden age of poetry in France. It's the time of Victor Hugo, Charles Baudelaire, and Paul Verlaine, to name just a few. Even today, most French native speakers' knowledge of poetry is intimately connected with the 19th century. As a result, Châtelain's poetical choices are representative of two things: the century's poetical self-consciousness and the translator's class awareness when dealing with the most graphic elements of Chaucer's bawdy tales. The second edition to be used was published in 1908, in Paris, this time by renowned scholar Émile Le Gouy, although the translation itself was the result of a collective effort of French professors of English. The Miller's prologue and tales were, for instance, translated by Joseph Delcourt. And unlike Châtelain's edition, Le Gouy's publication attempted to produce a text of academic value that would help students of Chaucer understand his poetry. The translations are, as a result, much more faithful to the Middle English text than Châtelain's poetical transposition, but still very much remain cautious when dealing with potentially shocking content. From 1908, we then move to almost the following century with André Crépin's translation, first published in 1998 and republished in 2010 as Les Contes de Cantorbéry et autres œuvres. Crépin was the first to produce a translated edition of Chaucer's complete works with the help of several scholars, including notably Derek Brewer and Juliette Dore. It's a remarkable edition, albeit imperfect in many ways, but that has merit of introducing French speakers and readers to what Crépin defined as a little encyclopedia of the English Middle Ages. So, published over a period of 150 years, these editions all share a common desire to transfer the essence of Chaucer's poetry into French. But in order to successfully translate Chaucer's comic tales, it's imperative to adapt its humor. Despite centuries of language change, the irony and sheer unruliness of his fabliaux are still perceptible. they are merely muffled by what my fellow Chaucer translation, Jose Francisco Botelho, called a procession of medieval paraphernalia. As Virginia Woolf noted in The Pestance and Chaucer, much of Chaucer is improper, at least a few lines in each of the tales, and it gives us as we read it the strange sensation of being naked to the air after being muffled in old clothing. And this sudden nakedness is something I really wanted to preserve in my translation. But first I needed to clothe my readers with a comfortable medieval outfit. I consequently decided to translate all of Chaucer's lines in a poetical prose that would give me the flexibility of prose with the rhythmic quality of poetry. As verses become paragraphs, each line is translated by a sequence of equal length, with Chaucer's end rhymes, when they are reproduced, effectively turning into middle rhymes. Subject-verb inversions and alliterations equally contribute to the production of a poetical sensibility within a prose setting. In my translation, turning Chaucer back into French is, ironically enough, part of the process of domestication that gives readers a sense of temporal distance and provides much of the cultural context of the text. Thus clothed with Chaucerian attire, I'm free to blow my readers' medieval socks off. And the poetical prose and archaisms attract the readers in a comfortable textual space. And that is when the sudden appearance of sexual lingo and of an improper setting produce their desired effect. So in order to illustrate my attempts to save Chaucer's naughty bits, I've selected two extracts from the Miller's tale that will serve as a case study. Our first extract goes as follows, and I won't read it because you all know it. We've seen it in several presentations today. The scene is graphic enough, but the narrator reinforces its impropriety with sexual innuendos and puns based on certain words' connotations. As Umberto Eco remarked, a good translation is not concerned with the denotation, but with the connotation of words. And I attract your attention on the sentence in bold here. The problems are: one, how many secondary senses can be conveyed by a linguistic expression, and two, which ones a translation should preserve at all costs. It would accordingly be quite simple for a translator to avoid some of the secondary senses of this passage and explain the gist of puns in a footnotes. But we all know the awkward silence that usually follow when you try to explain a joke. So I thought that in this case, I would slightly rewrite the text and recreate this scene in a way that would make French readers laugh or be shocked, well, react in a way. In this passage, so I started by playing with the presentation of the main protagonists. Chaucer repeatedly uses the adjective hende throughout this tale to describe the clerk. The word appears about 11 times with his name as an epithet, hende Nicholas. But as the narrative unfolds, we realize that he's not really courteous or gracious, those being the first two definitions of the word found in the Middle English dictionary. Hende also possesses a different meaning that is interesting to preserve, namely near or close by. As Paul E. Breitner comments, Nicholas being a boarder in Alison's house is hende, always near. It gives Nicholas an advantage over his rival Absalom in proximity to the lady of their fancy. In their own translation, my predecessors chose to ignore this secondary sense. Hende Nicholas thus becomes ce beau Nicolas for Châtelain, Nicolas le Gracieux for Delcourt, et l'aimable Nicolas for Crépin. Alison, on the other hand, is described as a young wife, which the translators in our corpus chose to translate rather timidly as jeune ménagère, jeune femme, and jeune épouse. I wanted to be a little more imaginative, however, especially given what is about to happen in the scene and in the tale. By turning the epithet into two words, I could describe the clerk as proche, a word defined as both someone who's close by and someone living under the same roof, potentially, or even someone related, and as noble, which becomes rather ironic in this passage given Nicholas' behavior. Likewise, the younger wife becomes une donzelle, a word whose primary meaning is a young woman, from the Latin dominicella, a diminutive of domina, but which now possesses a more colloquial connotation in modern French as a promiscuous woman. In my translation, both meanings are present, and it's up to the reader to decide from whose point of view they want to perceive Alison. Now, moving to the bodiest part of this passage, I instantly started thinking about a way to preserve Chaucer's quainter pun, made even more visible by being isolated in those lines as end rhymes. Clerks were first told are full subtile and full quaint. In this instance, Chaucer uses the adjective quaint, a loan word coming from the Old French quint, meaning wise, clever, ingenious. But he makes it rhyme with the noun quaint, namely a woman's private parts. So, how can we reproduce this hand rhyme and address the sexual aggression we are witnessing? In our corpus, we have several interesting variations that illustrate the translator's discomfort with the scene's obscenity. While there is no doubt whatsoever that Nicholas grabs Alison by the crotch, Crépin chose to tell us that il lui toucha la chose, a very elegant way of translating the Riverside Chaucer's note defining quainter as a pleasing thing. Likewise, Delcourt uses a euphemism leading Nicholas to catching Alison by a vous savez quoi. But no translator avoids lexical faithfulness and a possible embarrassment with as much flair as Chatelain, who in 1857 tells us that the clerk grabbed Alison by un certain endroit que je ne nommerai pas. So you can see the knight being offended by what he's translating. My own translation, however, addresses the situation and reproduces Chaucer's pun in a way. But since I could not use the French word quint, whose medieval meaning has disappeared in modern French, I had to rewrite the clerk's description, which becomes les clercs sont gens fort subtils et non cons. Quainter thus becomes non con, namely not stupid. Broadly speaking, the meaning hasn't changed much. Clerks remain clever somehow. I've just decided to affix a negation to the adjective con in order to produce a positive description with a very popular French colloquialism. Con is indeed our F word. It punctuates discussion in French and is used to describe almost everyone we meet on a daily basis. Its sudden appearance is particularly efficient because of this sentence poetical resonance. In les clercs sont gens fort subtils et non cons, I willingly omitted the article de in order to produce a 10-foot-long phrase with a poetical rhythm. At this particular moment, I did not want my readers to forget that they were reading poetry. The longer I could sustain this illusion, the better, because they would never see the obscenity of the rest of the Miller's tale coming. In this case, when Nicolas finally grabs Alison, I could reproduce the pun and double the shock already produced by the presence of the word con, which gives les clercs sont gens fort subtils et non cons, en privé donc il l'a pris par le con. Here the word con is a perfect transposition of the Middle English noun quaint, both having a possible similar etymology, the Latin conus. One of the most entertaining sexual innuendos in this passage then follows when Nicholas starts to talk. He tells Alison that if he cannot have her, for deren love of they lemon is pille. There's a lot to be said about this line. Sadly, it's been translated without any consideration for its bawdiness. Chatelain has de mon amour pour toi je mourrai ma mignonne, Delcourt pour mon secret amour de toi, mamie je vais périr, and Crépin has chérie aime-moi vite, ou bien je vais mourir. All three translators offer a rather straightforward adaptation and only differ from each other in their understanding of the word lemon. All three either willingly ignored the joke or simply did not see it. Yet if one looks at the different meanings of the verb spillen, to die, to pine away for love, but also to spill out, to flow out, and its syntactic proximity with lemon, an almost perfect homonym of semen, the innuendo becomes rather obvious. In order to keep both surface and deep senses of this line, I first had to cheat and turn it into two 10-foot-long sentences. And since I could not reproduce Chaucer's double entendre, I had to recreate the joke, which becomes par amour pour toi, ô ma tendre amie, je déverserai l'essence de ma vie. I started by translating lemon by ma tendre amie, very courteous expression, fitting of Hende Nicholas, and that sustains both the irony of the situation and the poetical nature of the textual space. The idea of both dying and spilling, however, was translated by L'essence de ma vie, which the clerk threatens of spilling. One could simply understand that here that he suggests a dramatic gesture. He'll kill himself and make his blood flow. On the other hand, the essence of life usually refers in French to something else, and it's semen that usually comes to mind, not blood, which offers a completely different interpretation of what Nicholas intends to do if he cannot have sex with Alison or Latons. And despite Nicholas' threats of either masturbating or killing himself, Alison resists physically at this point. The last line of this passage was particularly entertaining to translate because I decided to add a pun of my own based on the natural semantic evolution of the French language that would reinforce the fabliaux effect. Chatelain writes, for instance, par ma foi, ne veut pas t'embrasser, Nicolas. Delcourt has je ne te baiserai point, and Crépin has je ne veux pas t'embrasser. Delcourt's approach to the line in 1908 is, however, much more interesting. By translating the line literally as je ne te baiserai point, it gave me a unique opportunity to develop the tale's humor. Indeed, the prime meaning of the verb baiser has always been to kiss, and Delcourt's readers at the beginning of the 20th century would not have been shocked by his use of the word. In the last few decades, however, baiser acquired new meaning in French and has now become synonymous with, pardon my French, fucking. As a result, my own translation, je ne te baiserai point, par ma foi, je ne te baiserai pas, which follows Delcourt, proposes two different meanings. I will not kiss you, and the secondary colloquial meaning, I will not fuck you. Given the context, I thought Chaucer would not blame me for introducing this pun, since Nicholas wants to do much more than just kiss Alison. A translation can thus express, as Umberto Eco once again underlined, an evident deep sense of a text, even by violating both lexical and referential faithfulness. And I'm almost to the end, but so the end of the Miller's Tale undoubtedly counts as one of the most iconic moments of the Canterbury Tales. I've accordingly chosen to focus on the Miller's conclusion here so as to continue our exploration of Chaucer's obscenity in translatio. And so just these few lines, and that'll be the end of my case study. So there's no subtle or hidden secondary meaning in those lines, which should thus be easy enough to translate. The verb swiven clearly means to have sex, but it's used in the perceived form, encourages one to look at Alison, who's not even mentioned at this point by name, as mere sexual object. Some of our translators, however, proved a bit shy and refused to fully embrace the scene's meaning. So we have Delcourt, for example, translates swived as fut caressé. For Crépin, it becomes se fit sauter, which is much more colloquial. She was screwed, literally. And Chatelain has another approach. Once again, he completely ignores the sexual nature of the fabliaux and has fut, hélas, comment dire cela d'une façon honnête, m'y voici, fut uni au courtois Nicolas. One can easily imagine him sweating as he looks for a delicate and honest way of stating the obvious. Crépin, on the other hand, avoids euphemisms, as I've said. For him, the carpenter's wife was clearly screwed. My own translation of the first two lines goes as follows. Ainsi fut donc la femme du charpentier baisée malgré sa crainte et jalousie. Although I liked Crépin's way of putting things, I wanted to echo my own pun from line 3284 by once again using the verb baiser. This time, however, the context and use of the passive form clearly suggests the colloquial meaning of the word. The reader can therefore go back and forth to the beginning and end of Nicholas and Alison's affair and see its carnal evolution expressed by the semantic shift of the verb baiser. The incident involving Alison and Nicholas's bottoms was equally interesting to approach. Chatelain is unsurprisingly the only translator who prefers a euphemism to talk about Alison's backside, which becomes tout autre chose. Delcourt, Crépin, and I have all chosen the obvious translation, œil d'en bas. As for Nicholas, Each translator approaches us from a different angle. Chatelin mentions that the clerk was burned au bas du dos, while Delcourt talks about his derrière. Crépin has a much more interesting vision of things, one that I decided to develop. For him, Nicolas a le croupion en feu, an expression that refers to the French colloquialism avoir le feu au cul, namely to be on heat. In my own translation, this line becomes et Nicolas, lui, a le feu au cul. I chose to keep the expression as graphic as possible, increasing slightly the vulgarity of the Middle English tout, to underline both Nicholas's state of constant sexual arousement and his painful encounter with Absalom. And so, to conclude this case study, it's allowed us to realize that the reception of Chaucer's obscenity has long been problematic. Translators have either chosen to ignore the most graphic aspects of his fabliaux or deliberately rewrote certain passages in order to turn it into their conception of what is decent and proper. As I've explained, most of our understanding of poetry in France comes from 19th century poetry, from Hugo, Verlaine, or Baudelaire. When exposed to a poetical language, we instantly associate it with romantic poetry. That is why it was so important to me, for me to translate Chaucer's text in poetical prose. I wanted to invite my readers to immerse themselves in a textual space they would recognize, even if they were not familiar with the referentiality of Chaucer's language. Not expecting medieval poetry to be so lively, their sudden exposure to Chaucer's naughty bits would be even more entertaining. The contrast between their expectations of what poetry is supposed to be and the puns and sexual innuendo and graphic content reproduced in my translation accordingly mimics and echoes the dialogism of the tales. The voice of the translator, in this case, becomes an additional guide on the road to Canterbury. And so, as the Miller remarked, mon compte est dit, Dieu sauve la compagnie. Thank you.